Welcome in to the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And man, we got a show lined up for the listeners. Hugh Freeze, come on down. Back in the SEC. Cannot wait to see all. I mean, it's not even official. It is official, but he has not coached a single day yet here at Auburn, and already we're getting some wild stories on the plane. So this is going to be a wild, wild ride. We'll just put it that way. But heck, we got other news and notes around the SEC. A little preview here. Comments from Kirby and Brian Kelly previewing the SEC Championship. And of course, every Tuesday, joined by friend of the show, Stephen Lassan of Athlon Sports. We're able to hit on all 14 SEC teams on this program. So let's just jump right into it. Loaded show. Hugh Freeze, it is official. Of course, you know by now, he's apparently been given a 6-year contract on the Plains, $6.5 million average on that deal. And it's pretty remarkable. I mean, he's making more than Josh Heupel right now. Who you outbidding here for Hugh Freeze? So, I don't know. I don't want to go down the road of all his personal issues and all, because time and time again, I've talked about how I do not like Hugh Freeze, the person. Hugh Freeze, the coach, he's probably going to do a great job at Auburn. He really is. Sell your soul, but you're getting a guy that's going to recruit his ass off. He's got something to prove. He's proven he can win at Ole Miss. He's a guy that I think can win big at Auburn. You got to remember, Nick Saban wanted to hire Hugh Freeze as an offensive coordinator a while back. Kirby Smart did hire him as an analyst. I want to say, I'm trying to think of the year, maybe his second or third season there in Athens. So the fact that Kirby and Nick Saban hold this man in high regard, if I'm an Auburn fan, that's got me fired up for what he'll bring to the Tiger program. Now, if you want to watch his introductory press conference, they've already announced 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Central Time. That's when Auburn will introduce Hugh Freeze as the new head coach of the Auburn Tigers. Still don't have official confirmation on what that means for Cadillac Williams. Will he stay? I don't know. Auburn fans desperately want him to, for good reason. Probably earned an associate head coach role with what he did the last few weeks as an interim. But let's focus here on back to Hugh Freeze, because whenever you say Hugh Freeze, I think SEC fans were immediately, aside from scandals and all those other things, what they think of is him beating Nick Saban back-to-back years. Hell of an accomplishment, something that, hell, I don't know if there's another SEC coach during the Nick Saban era that could say they've done that, which is good, obviously. But his record not as outstanding as you'd think. 19-21 Hugh was. Losing SEC record. Something to think about. 2 wins over Alabama, 2 losses against Vanderbilt. He lost to Memphis when he had a 10-win team. Same year. Losing to Memphis. 10-win. What the hell? Mississippi State, the Egg Bowl, that heated rivalry. He did have a winning record, 3-2. But the guy that I'm seeing a lot of dissatisfied Auburn fans compare Hugh Freeze to, and I think it's fair, Gus Malzahn. Hugh Freeze was 1-3 against Gus Malzahn. So again, I mean, I guess I'm kind of walking both sides of the line here. I think Hugh will do well, but he's not this grand slam outstanding coach. I really don't think. And yes, when Liberty, he made Liberty relevant, got, Malik, whatever the heck his name is. Now he's the Titans quarterback. Great job. Got that guy developed. Who was at Auburn, ironically. Now, coming to Liberty, developed him into an NFL prospect. He'll fix the biggest issue Auburn's had in recent years. Quarterback, development, recruiting, all that. So that's another feather in old Hugh's cap there on the Plains. But I don't know. This is interesting. It's interesting to see the mixed results. People jumping on board. People madder in hell. I feel like Auburn could have done a lot better here. I honestly do. But, again, you got a guy that's driven, who's desperate to get back into the SEC. There's a lot to like. There's a lot not to like. Cannot wait to see how this shapes out for Auburn. But how about this? This is fantastic. Pat Forty. He's not always the most popular guy there out in the media, but he's reliable. He doesn't make up stories or anything like that. He works for Sports Illustrated, if you don't know, been covering college football a long, long time. And he is reporting, it's the first time I've ever heard something like this in a coach's contract. Hugh Freeze has agreed to relinquish control of his social media accounts when he becomes the Auburn coach, according to multiple sources. That's Pat Forty of Sports Illustrated. So they trust Hugh with $40 million and one of the most valuable football programs in the country, but they don't trust him to run a Twitter account. Think about that. I mean, what the hell are we talking about here? And if you don't know, surely you do by now, but Hugh is known to DM people. He's done it to me. He's done it to me many a times, which it doesn't bother me. He can do whatever the hell he wants. But where he does come in trouble, there was an alleged rape victim, one of many at Liberty, and he was apparently DMing her, kind of, I don't want to say threatening, that's not the right word, but he's basically, just Google it, you'll find it real quick, but he's basically questioning why the woman is talking bad about Liberty and all this. So, I mean, we can't have that. Again, this is probably why, if this is even true from Pat Forty, again, Pat Forty, I trust his reporting here, multiple sources, but if that's really in the contract, that's why it's in there. But just goes back to what I said at the beginning. This is going to be a hell of a ride. I hope for Auburn fans' sake you get some big-time wins out of it, win a couple Iron Bowls. But it's going to be entertaining nonetheless. So from that aspect, glad to have old Hugh back. It's going to be a hell of a lot more entertaining than old Brian Harsin. But at the end of the day, and winning trumps all. I mean, I'm not naive, but I sit here and I think of all the good that Cadillac brought to that university the last month or so, the togetherness, the family, the energy, the enthusiasm, all the support. And it almost feels like we sold all that for old Hugh Freeze in his 2 wins over Alabama. That's kind of how I see it. And one last thing, look at his debut season. It's going to be pretty interesting. Great slate. If you're not pissed off, if you haven't sold your season tickets, you're in for a hell of a ride here. Hugh Freeze's debut season at Auburn. Almost said Ole Miss. It's going to take me a couple weeks. Debut season here at Auburn. Tigers host. I'm just going over SEC here. Georgia. Ole Miss, his former team. Mississippi State, former rival. And Alabama. That's a hell of a slate right there. On the road in SEC, Texas A&M, LSU, Vanderbilt, and Arkansas. So, man, this is going to be fun. No doubt. No doubt about it. And again, we'll be covering Hugh and his press conference. Can't wait to hear what he's got to say now that he is officially Auburn's next head coach. Well, speaking of the coaching carousel, things really starting to heat up here on Monday morning. Big news. Something the Gamecocks have been waiting for. Marcus Satterfield will not be returning. No, he was not fired. Believe it or not. He's jumping ship to Nebraska. Apparently, he used to work with Matt Rule there at the Carolina Panthers, and I think at a couple other stops. Matt Rule's taking over at Nebraska, giving Marcus Satterfield the offensive coordinator role. And for the life of me, I cannot remember a program losing a coordinator to another Power 5 program and being this damn excited for it. Maybe Georgia losing Jim Chaney to Tennessee. That's probably a close second right there. But Marcus Satterfield went out on a high note, beating Tennessee, beating Clemson, two of the best wins of the Shane Beamer era, back-to-back. Marcus Satterfield's last two games as play caller. Can't get much worse, though, than the other games we saw. So look for South Carolina to upgrade at offensive coordinator. And, this is best for all parties involved because it was getting nasty. Seeing SEC Nation come to Columbia, all the signs, fire Satterfield. And, the guy, there's not a assistant coach that took more of a beating than Marcus Satterfield this fall in the SEC. So, hey, good for him, landing another job, not getting fired by his buddy Shane Beamer. Again, this works out for everybody, and it's hard to imagine South Carolina not improving upon this season's OC. Now, the biggest question, how will this affect Spencer Rattler's future? We'll know in the weeks to come. But again, no inside information here, but it doesn't seem like Spencer Rattler was too thrilled with Satterfield at times. So I don't know if this really even hurts you in that regard either. Just something to think about. Well, speaking of coordinators getting a boot, this one had to happen. And not even his fault, more of a sacrificial lamb here. Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher has made the decision to move on from Darell Dickey, who had the offensive coordinator title in name only. Jimbo's offense, Jimbo calling the plays. Don't even know what Darell Dickey did down there, to be honest with you. But he's gone, which clears the way for an offensive coordinator to come in there. Hopefully a play caller to fix their offensive woes. So Jimbo, what he said on Saturday after beating LSU, maybe he's backed off that. This is a great sign for Texas A&M. This sounds terrible because for all indications, everything I've been told, Darell Dickey, hell of a guy, great guy. So it sucks that it had to come to him losing his job, which again is not his fault. But they got to make room for somebody, and we'll see who that is. But with the resources they got down there in College Station, should be anybody they want to come down there. The big question is how much autonomy, how much willingness is Jimbo to adapt and take on new ideas from an offensive coordinator. That's going to be the storyline of the offseason there in College Station. One last coaching update here. Kentucky fires special teams coordinator, running backs coach John Settle. We've been saying Kentucky, there's going to be an offensive overhaul this offseason in Lexington. This is the first domino to fall. Special teams have just been a disaster for the Kentucky Wildcats, particularly in that Georgia game. There was one field goal, bad snap, bad hold, bad kick. Yeah, so, this will get things fixed. Mark Stoops, non-committal when kind of talking about will they hire a special teams coordinator. I think you should go that way now that we got 10 full-time assistant coaches, but we'll see. Not every coach does it. We'll just have to see who's out there for Kentucky to hire, but that's notable. And I know Missouri fans freaking out. Dominic Lovett headed to the transfer portal, likely headed to a new team. But old Luther Burden, I love this. I'll throw it up here on the YouTube, but he announced, hey, I'm going nowhere. And not only did he announce that, he did it with one of his bags of chips over here. Free ad. That's how you do it right there. You're going viral because Missouri fans are going to be fired up that you're staying. The ad company's going to be just thrilled that everybody's sharing this message. Perfect marketing in the NIL era. Good news all around. Luther's getting paid. Mizzou fans staying happy. Great news there. So, all right, last thing before we get to our interview with Stephen Lassan. Long interview with Stephen. We'll hit on all 14 SEC teams. A lot of topics to cover with Stephen Lassan. But Kirby Smart met with the media today. Brian Kelly met with the media today. Let's kick it over to Kirby first. Discusses his team rising to the occasion, needing to be more consistent. I thought that was kind of important. Stetson Bennett not performing on an elite level. I think it's fair to say down the stretch. Kirby, not freaking out. He never is. But just thought of notable comments there. And then on defending, Jaden Daniels, going to be key to the game here. Let's kick it over to Kirby.
Kirby, you guys have had some games this year where maybe there's been some lulls and then everybody's really turned it on, almost kind of like when they had to. I don't know if you would count it as desperation time or whatever, but would you agree that that's kind of been a trait of this team, that some of the guys or the team has played as well as they can when they really have had to this year?
I do think their resilience is shown through, meaning when they've had an opportunity to play in adverse situations, they've done a good job of that. I don't have an explanation for why we might not play with the consistency. I think every coach would say the number one trait they want to have is consistency in performance, and we really haven't had consistency in performance, maybe not as much as the team the year before's had, but what they have had is resiliency, competitiveness, pridefulness, and response mechanism has been pretty positive. And I think that's comes through training. You don't just get good at that by happenstance. You have to really work at it. And we said at the beginning of the year this team was going to be different, and the difference was going to be they had to have a lot of grit and toughness, and they've had that so far.
I guess this is all kind of related, but toward the end of the year, has Stetson not played as well in your opinion, or has it been more about the opponent?
No, I think he's played well. I think he's done what we've asked him to do. I think he continues to do that. Then we'll be successful because what we've asked him to do, he's done. He has played some formidable, good opponents, and he's played really well against those teams. He's had a couple decisions I think he would like to have back, but he's also made some really, really spectacular plays. So sometimes when you put a lot on a player, you may get some of that. You may get a mistake. You may get something he wishes he had back. But he also has some really incredible plays.
I always feel like it comes a topic of conversation whenever you guys go up against a quarterback that can move around a little bit. You guys obviously have Stetson. Can you kind of compare Jaden to other runners you've kind of seen in this conference? And how elite is he in that aspect of his game?
Yeah, everybody you talk to, he's way faster than you envisioned. He is athletic. He can go into super quick hyperspeed mode, run away from you, run around you. He stiff arms guys. He's really athletic, but it's not like he's one of these guys that can't throw. He's a pocket passer, and he's very polished. He throws the ball really, really well, and he's extremely athletic. So he's the combination that when you start saying, all right, what do I got to have to beat people in this league, is an athletic quarterback that can beat you with his arm, and he's that.
Now on the flip side, Brian Kelly, no one saw this run coming to the SEC championship game. Everybody had Alabama pegged in this role, but it's them LSU Tigers making it to Atlanta. What would it mean for Brian Kelly in year one to win the SEC championship in his first season in the league? How incredible. Players buying into the process. He says they're still not even completely there yet, which I thought was interesting. And finally, on defending, one Darnell Washington, Agent Zero down there in Athens. Good luck. That's about all I got to say on that one.
Coach, what would it mean to win the SEC championship, regarded as the top conference in America, especially after what you inherited and the situation you were in a year ago?
Yeah, I think it would be obviously something that we would all feel great about in our first year here at LSU. But I think, overall, it's hard to win SEC championships. It's so hard. There's so many good teams. We've just talked about how you have to play week to week in the regular season. But to get there and then win it all, it's that's why somebody asked me yesterday about do you think that if they expand the playoffs that an SEC championship would be devalued? And I said, absolutely not. You don't know what you have to go through to actually get here. And that's why I think it would never be devalued, and it would be such a huge thing for this football program.
Ryan, down here. You've talked obviously a lot this year about processes, and that's kind of been like the key to your program in general in this season. When did you feel like maybe the players had finally kind of adopted those things and the things that were clicking in terms of, I guess, off the field processes and all that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's like anything else. You know, when you put in a new way of doing things, new standards. It's like anything in life. You go to a new business or a new operation, there's a new way of doing things. You know, that just takes time. I don't know that we're there yet. I think the first year is really, you know, setting those standards, making sure that they understand. I think we're at that level of, you know, conscious competence. You know, we know what to do, we know how to do it, but it's really hard for us. And we want to get to, you know, where it's unconscious competence. We don't have to think about it. You know, it's just we do it, and we do it the right way every day. And I think it's still a process for us. They understand it a lot better, so I think that's where that level is, but we still have another level to go.
Hey, Coach, right here. You're going up against a 6'7", 270-pound tight end this week. How do you combat that?
Hope they don't throw it to him? Is that what you mean? Yeah, I mean, look, sometimes, you know, we break this game down to, you know, one player against one. You're hoping that in some situations that your zone coverage where you have somebody underneath them over the top. Because really, I mean, if you look at it, if it's just a one-on-one situation, he's a pretty, you know, unique athlete, and that he can line up and has lined up at wide receiver. That's not a great matchup for anybody. So, you know, you've got to take some of those things away. You've got to be able to help with underneath coverage, over the top. Sometimes there's bracket situations where, you know, you've got a corner with an inside backer and a safety, and that triangle kind of takes away throwing lanes, because if it's just as simple as one guy versus one guy, that's not a favorable situation. But you may get that sometimes, and you're hoping the pass rush gets there. You're hoping that Stetson can't find him, you know, things of that nature, because it is a matchup issue.
These two teams will arrive in Atlanta, I believe, on Thursday. Now, I know they have a coaches press conference on Thursday. Kirby Smart, Brian Kelly, Greg Sankey, kind of a state of the union of the SEC. So we're going to get a lot more Georgia LSU talk, including with Steven here in just a second. But, yeah, you know, this is not something so just be aware. We're going to have a lot more commentary on the SEC championship all week long. But now let's kick it over to our latest interview with Steven Lassan of Athlon Sports. All right, hey, we're pleased to once again be joined by friend of the show, Steven Lassan. Of course, you know him, senior editor of Athlon Sports. Give him a follow at Athlon Steven on Twitter. And don't forget to check out his outstanding YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Steven, how's it going, man?
Hey, Mike, it's going great. It's always good to talk to you. I hope you and everyone else had a great Thanksgiving and enjoyed all the wonderful football that we had. The matchups between rivals were great. Looking forward to SEC championship game this weekend. All the roster, all the coaching chaos that's already ensuing and about to go on. So always good to talk to you and talk about all things SEC.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention, Steven, main reason we got you on this episode, we got the transfer portal opening up here in a week's time. So we're going to do a deep dive on portal team needs for all 14 SEC teams. Like you said, the SEC championship game. Hugh Freeze just got hired. Oh, Lordy. I mean, we got a lot to talk about, but let's start with the SEC championship game, Steven, because I feel bad because I think this game lost a ton of luster with LSU losing to Texas A&M. This would have been a top 5 showdown. Do you think it lost some luster? But here I am looking at all these other conference matchups outside of the Big 12. I mean, there's not really a great matchup on the board this weekend. Do you think this could be a competitive ball game, or do you think that LSU kind of showed their true colors last week in College Station?
I think the first thing is I agree with you. Most of the conference championships this week, there's just not a lot at stake. I mean, USC on Friday night playing Utah, basically a win and in the playoff type of scenario. But last week's games, I think, in looking at the playoff rankings, there's just not a lot of high profile matchups. And I do think that this game lost a little bit of steam, because had you had LSU still being ranked where they were, not losing to A&M, you could go into a scenario where, hey, if LSU wins this game, they get a shot to make the playoff. If you beat Georgia, the number one team, you got a chance to make your way in. And without that, you're seeing like 16, 17 point spread in this game. I think it's a little hard to get excited for. But I will say, just as a fan of college football, the SEC championship game has always been like one of my favorites every year, because I can remember watching the first, second SEC championship game back when it was at Legion Field, and then it was at the Georgia Dome. And there have been a lot of great games over the years. So I'm hopeful that this one will be closer than the spread is telling us. But I think a lot's going to have to go right for LSU to keep this one close, because I think it's going to be a pretty heavy lift against a Georgia team that, yes, they have been a little bit inconsistent at times, but I think that this is the best team in college football.
Why do you think that Georgia has been inconsistent? And again, we're picking apart the best team in the country here, so we're not saying you're terrible or horrible or anything like that, so don't blow up our mentions. But, I mean, you look at things like Stetson Bennett only had 28 passing yards last week in the first half against Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, not a very good team. That Kentucky performance, what was it, 16-6 or whatever it was? I mean, a little bit ugly, but maybe that's just because you got such an elite defense. You knew you didn't have to score a ton. Why is it that you think that Georgia has been showing a little inconsistencies? And does that give you any reservations about the Bulldogs? Maybe not even in this SEC championship, but for the college football playoff, which is the ultimate goal there in Athens.
No, I think that is a fair question. Like, can you turn it on when you need to? And so far, Georgia has this year. I mean, they had the big win over Oregon in the season opener. They took care of business against Florida in the rivalry game, and then, of course, the Tennessee game. So they've met the moment every time when they've needed to this year. And I think that gives me optimism that when they play their first round, if they do well in that game, of course, they'll go to the national championship. I'm pretty optimistic that Georgia will. I think Kirby will have his guys ready to play. I think if you're trying to make a case for why this team has maybe been inconsistent a little bit this year, I think one of them is the way the matchups have played out the last 2 weeks. I mean, Kentucky and Georgia Tech, watching Georgia Tech basically say that we're going to run the time down on the time clock until the very end and basically get a snap off with 2 seconds and just slow the game down, shorten it. I think that kind of played a role in the Kentucky game with possessions. And we saw this with Georgia Tech on Saturday too. The hard part about that is you have to be really perfect to beat Georgia. So in both of those instances, even though they may have shortened the game a little bit, it's really hard to do against this Georgia team. So I think there's that factor. The other one is probably just more about, it's the same thing that every team fights coming into a year. You win a national championship, it's really hard to get the band back together and be perfect again. So it's, I guess, maybe a little bit of natural feeling only to say, hey, every week we're just not going to have 100%. Maybe we're only operating at 70%, but that 70% is still good to beat almost about every team in college football. So I think some of those, there are some personnel things, but some of this just might be Georgia doesn't have to turn it on. And when they do, they've been able to. And as long as they can meet the moment, they should be fine the rest of the year.
In this SEC championship, do you think it comes down to Todd Monken's offense against Matt House defense? I mean, I can't wait to see that matchup. I still think I would favor Georgia, but from what we've seen of LSU, if Perkins gets on fire, if B.J. Ojulari heats up, I mean, they could give Georgia some real problems on that side of the ball, and they have always got a very talented secondary this season there in Baton Rouge. Do you think that that matchup, LSU's defense, Georgia offense, do you think that'll decide the game?
I do. I think it's a must-see matchup for those reasons that you mentioned. I mean, Ojulari and Perkins, your best case for LSU is you've got to cause some havoc. Like, you've got to create some turnovers. You've got to get some takeaways. You've got to get some negative plays. And the best way to do that is with those two guys up front. Covering Brock Bowers and Washington is going to be such a challenge. So I think you've got to find ways to get to the quarterback, create those kind of splash plays that can sort of tilt the game in your favor. If this game is just an even matchup where both teams are going, back and forth, that favors Georgia. LSU needs to win some of those negative plays, turnovers, maybe a play on special teams to steal this one up. Because I think on the other side of the ball, when you look at what Georgia's defense can do against LSU's offense, if I'm Georgia, I'm doing everything I can to keep Jaden Daniels in the pocket. He's got a banged up ankle. Is he 100% for this game? You don't want his mobility to beat you here. You want to make him stand in the pocket and make those throws downfield. And I think Georgia's front, and especially with up front of the line, linebackers, rush, whatever they have to do. We saw this against Tennessee. I think they can do that on Saturday. So I really think LSU's defense may have to help the offense and get some short fields and create some of those negative plays like you were mentioning.
Yeah, and LSU's got some young talent on that offensive line, very promising players, but this is not a game to come in and not ready to play against this Georgia front seven. So that could be a nightmare matchup for LSU. But let me ask you this, Stephen. Do you think if Jaden Daniels is limited, I hope he's not because he's such a weapon. Heck, I believe he's number 10 in the SEC in rushing with the regular season now over. Can Jaden Daniels sit back there and beat Georgia from the pocket, taking into consideration he does have some outstanding receivers to throw the ball to, but do you think LSU can win a ball game like that?
I think it's to be determined. I think if I'm LSU, we have to have a healthy Jaden Daniels to win this game. We have to use his mobility. He has to be able to get to the edge, whether it's through just rollouts. It's not to mention his ability to make plays just on the ground, just rushing yards, keeping when the pocket breaks down. We see this time in and time out. His ability to just scramble and get a first down is huge. So I think that if I'm Georgia, I'm taking my chances with just keeping him bottled up. And yeah, you're right. They've got playmakers on the outside, but I'm okay if Jaden Daniels stands in there and makes those throws. If he's rushing for 90, 100 yards, that's a problem for Georgia. So I think that's a matchup to watch on Saturday for sure.
Well, last thing I got on this game, Stephen, it would be unthinkable for Georgia to lose this game, but a lot of people were saying that last year. With Alabama, you got to remember, nearly lost the Iron Bowl. They were not a massive underdog, but they were an underdog, and most assumed Georgia would just crush them. But Georgia lost that game and still made their way to the college football playoff. I assume that would still be the case this season. First of all, I wonder if you agree with that statement. Can Georgia lose this SEC championship and still make the college football playoff? And if that is your opinion, it's almost like LSU's got all the motivation in this game, and with Georgia maybe doesn't have quite as much. And I certainly think that played a factor last season. Of course, maybe Georgia losing that game gets them locked in for this one. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if I'm LSU, you're playing with house money here. You've got everything, like nothing to lose. Georgia's got all the pressure on them to finish the season undefeated. If they win, they should be the number one seed in the playoff rankings. I think if they lose, they're fine. I think at this point they're in. It's just a matter of whether they're number one or number two probably in the final rankings. But I think that gives LSU an advantage here, is that if I'm Brian Kelly, whatever tricks you got in your playbook you haven't used this year, special teams plays, whatever it is, you can use it. I mean, you're the heavy underdog here. Not many people, I haven't been able to find one that picked LSU to go to the SEC championship game this year. Maybe there is somebody out there, but that's the setup for me. Is LSU's got nothing to lose. They can come in, play loose. They can just, if they lose by 25, everyone would have expected it, but there's a lot to gain here. And if they can keep it close, maybe they can get some good bounces in the fourth quarter to keep this one a little bit closer and try and steal it. So if you're LSU, no pressure at all the pressure in the world on Georgia. But Georgia has also met that moment every time this year. And I think that's why it's 16, 17 point spread at most places.
All right, so obviously the big story here in the SEC on Monday, Stephen, Hugh Freeze officially hired as the next Auburn head football coach. honestly, Stephen, I mean, I know saw the reports, when things were trending this way. I'm pretty stunned that John Cohen made this decision with his history. I thought as soon as they hired John Cohen, I thought Hugh Freeze, take him off the list. What's your reaction just hours after Auburn makes this official, hiring Hugh Freeze?
I agree with you. But I also go back to something that we talked about when the Auburn job opened, which is it was going to be a very SEC hire. And it's also very opposite of Brian Harsin in that sense. Usually when you have a coaching change, you usually try to hire the opposite. If one thing didn't work out, you usually go the other direction. And so it's not really a surprise to me in the sense of Hugh Freeze is a guy who's been in the SEC. He's won games in the SEC. He understands recruiting in the conference. He's beat Nick Saban. He's put together good offenses. Like all of that lines up for what Auburn has needed. And after the Harsin experiment failed, you just had to think that somebody with SEC ties and experience was going to be the pick. So I think the Cohen factor added a little bit of mud to the picture, but at the end, it was always either going to be, if it's not Kiffin, it's got to be Hugh Freeze, because you start getting past that. And a lot of those other guys maybe weren't head coaches or coaches that just seemed out of reach for Auburn in this cycle. So in that sense, it makes sense. But the Cohen factor was an interesting side plot to all this.
Now, look, I'm not, so much is made about Hugh Freeze. It's no secret. I'm not a fan of his personally, but any concern in your mind, Stephen, that this is, I've seen some Auburn people, you say this, and I agree a little bit that, this is just, why'd we fire Gus? I mean, Hugh Freeze is basically, he's very similar to Gus Malzahn. Do you agree with that or disagree? I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's probably true. I mean, if you compare the two coaches, there are a lot of similarities. I also think that Gus may have just reached his expiration date at Auburn and things had gotten stale and it was time for change when he was let go. Now you can question the rest of the process about, hiring a coach and allowing boosters to meddle and all that. But I also think that's probably part of the appeal too for Freeze. Like he can play the game. He's very well versed in all of the layers and all the politics that go on at Auburn. He can play the game. And so I think when you start to look at all these factors, it just makes a ton of sense. If you can't get Kiffin, Hugh Freeze just checks all the boxes that you needed in this search.
Right. And again, moving aside from my personal issues with him, he's a hell of a coach. He's a great recruiter. He's going to work hard at it. He's a politician, like you're noting. He's had a long track record of successful offenses and quarterback development. That is something that has been severely lacking at Auburn over the years. Let me ask you this, Stephen. How do you think now there's no way to tell who's going to remain on the roster because of portal and so many other factors, but just looking at what he is inheriting there on the Plains, I think Robbie Ashford and Jarquez Hunter, I mean, these are nice pieces that seem to fit what Hugh Freeze wants to do. If those players are there next year, would you agree that, he's inheriting not the ideal SEC roster? Hell, that's kind of why he's coming in, because they're not where they need to be, but he's got some pieces to have some success right away.
I wasn't talking to you when the Iron Bowl was on Saturday, but I think we might have been on the same wavelength from this, because as I was watching the game and you're seeing what Robbie Ashford was doing, and he made a really nice touchdown throw. Forget if it was in the second, I think it was in the second half. But his skill set, based upon what you've seen of Hugh Freeze and his offenses, go back to Liberty, Malik Willis was successful in the NFL draft and then picked by the Titans. You can see a lot of what Hugh Freeze has done and how that could work well for Robbie Ashford. I mean, he certainly has some passing ability that is there. It just needs to be worked on. And there's some things that you can do to maybe mitigate some of the accuracy issues. They need more playmakers too, overall. But I think there's something to work with there. And I think if you're Hugh Freeze, you're coming into a situation, at least at the quarterback position, you're not starting from zero. You have somebody who has SEC experience, and he fits your offense well. So at least it gives them a good starting point. And I think very broadly, Auburn's going to hit the portal hard, and they should. I don't think they're going to be 3-9, 4-8 next year. I think they could be much better quickly because of what Hugh Freeze has done, and also how Ashford fits that offense, provided they can get some pieces around him.
And I would also assume, Stephen, that Auburn's got the resources to hire a very good defensive coordinator. Do you have any knowledge of what they're doing at Liberty, the defensive coordinator or anything? And not that they bring that guy along, because I honestly, I have no idea who that even is, but I just thought when they played Arkansas, I was very impressed by that defense. Any early candidates? I'm sure you're just speculating, but coordinators that Hugh Freeze would bring in to coordinate his Auburn defense.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was checking while you were asking me just to make sure I had this right, and Liberty had used sort of a kind of varied front, more of like a 3-3-5, using some hybrid edge rusher type stuff. So, I think you could see that. It also wouldn't surprise me if you get very kind of basic and just go back to a 4-man front, kind of like what Auburn has been using. So I think there's a lot of mystery there as to kind of, does Hugh Freeze bring some staff to Auburn? Do they go outside of there? But I think based upon what we saw at Liberty and also what we've seen in the past at Ole Miss, it seems like pretty varied. But also I think very broadly, I don't think this is just an offensive hire. Like what you mentioned is true about Hugh Freeze at Liberty. They had good defenses there. They were very physical. They got after the quarterback. This is not going to be just a team that tries to outscore you. I think that Freeze and this staff will understand that you have to piece together a good defense to go with that too.
Well, speaking of coaching change, your buddy Marcus Satterfield off to Nebraska. What? We finally got things going here at South Carolina, but the reality is, Stephen, Marcus Satterfield's time has wore thin there in Columbia, and I can't remember a fan base being this damn excited for a guy to get another job. Thoughts on Marcus Satterfield going to Nebraska to team up with Matt Rule, and where do you think South Carolina looks for his replacement?
Can we get a collage of box scores and moments of the Marcus Satterfield era and just some sad music behind it? No, in all seriousness, I guess we shouldn't be surprised. He's got ties to Matt Rule from previous stops. So in the end, I think this is actually a win-win for both parties. If you're South Carolina, you needed to move on from Marcus Satterfield. And so him finding a landing spot without having to go through a messy firing or divorce or anything is good for South Carolina. And if you're Marcus Satterfield, you get out of the situation. You go to Nebraska where you get a fresh start, and he'll probably have a lot more, leeway right away, because Nebraska's probably not going to be very good next year. Had he come back to South Carolina, you can bet that he would have been on the hot seat for the first bad play call in 2023. So I think it's a win-win for all parties. If you're thinking about candidates, I think there's a lot of names I think that are going to be thrown around. And I go back to one name that you and I talked about a few weeks ago, which was Warren Ruggiero, the offensive coordinator at Wake Forest. I love watching Wake Forest offenses because they really do a good job of getting the most out of that talent. And they've done, they're able to mix the run, but they also kind of have a wide open passing offense too. They use a lot of kind of unusual slow mesh reads, and it's kind of unusual if you haven't seen it. But I think that could play well with some of the existing talent that South Carolina has, provided it's all back next year. So I think this is an opportunity for Shane Beamer to take this program up a notch too. South Carolina has made tremendous progress over the last 2 years. If they get this hire right, they can take another step forward, because it's obvious that 10 games this year, the talent was not being managed. In the last 2, they were. Why it was, I will never understand it.
Well, yeah, that's the final thing I wanted to ask you on that, Stephen. We've been doing this a long time, and I cannot even come up with another version of this where, I mean, a guy was dead and buried, worst offensive coordinator in Power 5 seemingly, and then all of a sudden red hot, beating top 10 opponents back to back. Can you ever recall something like that?
Man, that's a great question. I can't. I mean, to your point, I mean, we watched South Carolina score 6 points on the road in Florida, and then they come back,
And that was special teams.
Right. And they come on and then come back home, take care of Tennessee. They go on the road and beat a Clemson team that they had struggled to beat over the last couple of years. And the scores have all been pretty one-sided. So I can't remember like a 2-game stretch where it was just such a remarkable turnaround. And it's you said this earlier today, which was just it's college football. I mean, one week a team looks like they're the worst team in the SEC, and all of a sudden South Carolina is going to finish comfortably in the top 25.
Right.
Go figure, right?
And I think the true secret of this, I'm kind of half joking when I say it's Marcus Satterfield and his awakening or anything. I think what really is the difference is Spencer Rattler and him being more free, but whatever was holding him back was not holding him back against Tennessee, certainly, and even against Clemson, he made some big time mistakes, didn't rattle him at all, and he kept firing, and of course they got the big win. So let me ask you, Stephen. I mean, I gotta imagine as polarizing as a prospect that's probably come out of college in years, and he's still in college, so I shouldn't say he's done, but do you think he's ready for the NFL? Do you think he's shown that he can make an NFL roster with his arm talent if they can unlock that? Or is he a guy that really needs to come back for another season? And does that complicate matters now that they don't have a coordinator, which maybe it helps because maybe he didn't want to come back and play for Marcus Satterfield. I don't know. It certainly didn't seem like a great fit. But also, Cousin Shane, we got to hand it to him. He, on the last episode, he noted, hell, it looks like most of the top receivers may be gone as well. So that could play a factor as well. So I realize that's a complicated question, but what would you, if Spencer Rattler called Steven Lassan and asked him for advice, what would you tell him?
I would probably tell him to come back to South Carolina for one more year. I think what's good for Spencer Rattler is the last 2 games, I think, are closer to the Spencer Rattler I thought we would see in the offseason. He's not going to put up the numbers he did as a redshirt freshman at Oklahoma, but I think the quarterback that's been there the last 2 weeks has a lot of talent and should be the Spencer Rattler that we see for 12, 13 games. And if you can do that, then you're going to increase your draft stock for next season. The caveat is some of the things that you mentioned. Who do they hire as offensive coordinator? Is it a big change? Also, what happens at the skill spots? What happens to your offensive line? The catch to that is Shane Beamer's been great at getting guys out of the portal. So I think if you're Spencer Rattler, you're kind of waiting to see how the landscape looks in all this, but based upon who maybe South Carolina can get in the portal. But I would have a lot of confidence that Shane Beamer can get a good coordinator. They're going to have the money to do so. They should also be able to go get guys out of the portal to restock at receiver. And also, it's a pretty attractive spot if you're a receiver. Maybe not as attractive, certainly, as Tennessee, but if you have Spencer Rattler as your quarterback next season, receivers want to come play for a good quarterback, obviously, and that can be a good selling point. He averaged 8.5 yards per attempt in wins and 6.8 in losses. And I think that goes to your point. It feels like South Carolina allowed him to be a little bit more free with pushing the ball downfield. And of course, he's got the arm strength to do that. So I personally would come back for one more year and have a chance to boost his draft stock.
Now, how about the same question for Anthony Richardson, Stephen, where Friday the nation got to showcase basically what Florida fans been living this year, Stephen. I mean, he starts out 3 for 5 with 3 touchdowns. I mean, he looked incredible. I was thinking, my God, Heisman Richardson showed up. And then he finished 4 of 20, dreadful. And I think in some part that's Florida basically had one receiver. So it's not all on him, but just a calamity of inconsistency is basically how I would sum up Anthony Richardson. So up and down, week in, week out. We've seen all the tools. At times he looks like he could be number 1 overall pick. At other times he looks like he's undraftable. So I don't know if Billy Napier's helping him or I don't know. I just don't know. But what's your thoughts on Anthony Richardson? Should he go pro? You know, if he knocks it out at the combine, he could be one of the fastest rising prospects. He's only got 1 season of true starting experience. He started that 1 game against Georgia last season. But what's your thoughts on Anthony Richardson? Should he stay? Should he go?
I'm Mr. Patience, and he showed up today, and I think he should come back to school. I think I understand the inconsistency from week to week and how frustrating it can be if you're a Florida fan. But I also think if you're Florida, I think that ought to be the goal, is to get take the skill set, take the tools that are there and the things that have, Richardson has shown growth in this year, and take that to another level this offseason. Give this staff a chance to elevate the talent around him. Because I think if you made a list of best players on Florida's offense, it starts with an offensive lineman that was a transfer. It starts with a running back that was a transfer, and a receiver that was a transfer, and a freshman running back. And I think that ought to speak volumes as to where this talent was coming into this year. They had a ton of guys at receiver hurt on Friday. So I believe in Billy Napier. I believe in this staff. I know they've gotten off to a little bit of a rough start, but I think some patience is needed here. And I think he should come back and start for 13 games and kind of hone in that skill set, that accuracy, everything that's there. And then next year make a run at the NFL draft, and especially if Florida can improve the pieces around him.
Now, what's your thoughts on SEC Coach of the Year now, Stephen? There's a couple good candidates. Kirby Smart, of course, 2 years in a row, undefeated. You don't give this award for 2 years, but everything they lost and how dominant they've looked at times, certainly he deserves all the recognition. Josh Heupel exceeded all expectations. Shane Beamer now, all of a sudden, we were maybe pushing him out. Now we got to give him a lifetime contract. He's finished so well. Brian Kelly, no one saw LSU, like you said, going to the SEC championship. Which of those 4, or maybe there's someone else on your list, who would you lean to give SEC Coach of the Year?
The problem with this is they're all deserving. Like, if we could solve the award into 4s and send them to all these coaches, we'd probably make everyone happy. Maybe. I actually think I would vote Josh Heupel. I think that you could make, like I said, a pretty compelling argument for Kirby Smart. Just they've lost a lot of guys to the NFL. They've reloaded. They're going to be favored to win the national championship. The late surge by South Carolina, I think, will get Shane Beamer into discussion. Kelly versus Heupel is tough. I don't necessarily think that head-to-head is everything. I think it's one part of it. But Tennessee having that victory over LSU is a talking point. I think that Tennessee could use in getting Heupel that award. Also, I look at this the wrong way, but I always say which teams exceeded my preseason expectations the most, and that was LSU and that was Tennessee. So I would probably vote Josh Heupel for SEC Coach of the Year. Just a great all-around job. Yes, there was the clunker against South Carolina, but to beat Alabama, to beat Florida, to have Tennessee at number 1 in the playoff, never would have guessed that this year. So he would get my SEC Coach of the Year vote.
Well, you just won me back some fans, Stephen, because, my God, are they out on me after I said, after that egg in Columbia, I can't vote Josh Heupel. That's just burned in my memory. I mean, college football playoff on the line. Of course, the way Southern Cal's come on, maybe Tennessee probably would have got the shaft anyway. But, yeah, I mean, I see it. I'm not – hell, I've been selling hope and hype and all this for Josh Heupel and them Vols all season long. But at the end of the day, I'm giving it to Kirby, just with all he lost and the consistency all season long of, like you said, maybe a game or two they overlooked, but hell, they keep winning. So he deserves that honor. But of course, in Georgia, they don't care about trophies other than the national championship these days. So, but by God, man, they'll. When I said Heupel for Coach of the Year, they cared then. I'll tell you that. But all right, so hey, we took all this time, Steve. We still haven't talked portal. That's what I really wanted to have you on about. And of course, this is all fluid. I mean, we're talking Spencer Rattler, we're talking Anthony Richardson. For all we know, they jump in the portal, which I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if that does, then all of a sudden quarterback becomes the biggest issue for those rosters. So that being said, we still don't know who's going off to the NFL, and there's going to be more and more transfers coming. I asked Steven to give his thoughts on an area or two for the SEC teams. Each one has roster needs that they really could utilize the transfer portal to shore up their roster. The transfer portal clearly has made a huge, huge impact on college football. LSU, Ole Miss, Tennessee, on and on and on. These programs would not be where they are this season without the additions they've made in the transfer portal. So that's why this next couple of weeks is going to be so paramount to what next season looks like. So having said all that, Stephen, let's just go in alphabetical order here. Let's start with the SEC West, if you don't mind. Alabama, which positions of that roster could you see the Crimson Tide attacking in the transfer portal?
I think the best place to start is I'm going to use the word Ferraris, because the Alabama is looking for.
No, we ain't talking Texas.
The Alabama is going for the elite of the elite. I mean, look at the additions last year. You know, Eli Ricks, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jermaine Burton. They're not just going to bring in any player to potentially start or contribute. So I think when you see very high level talent players, automatically ought to think Alabama. So that's the generic answer. The real answer, I think, is I'm looking at defense for Alabama, because you're going to be losing Will Anderson to the NFL. To'oto's gone. Battle and Branch at safety. You're going to have to restock there. Offensively, I still think everyone's going to be looking for offensive line help. And, you know, of course, bringing in Tyler Steen sort of solidified that left tackle spot this offseason. You may also need a game breaker at running back. McClellan and some others are going to be set there. But, you know, Jahmyr Gibbs is a pretty special player. So right now, I think filling out some of those needs on defense and then maybe giving the quarterback another option at running back and the offensive line is where I would be thinking for Alabama right now.
Yeah, Alabama's kind of like cheating. We could basically say best available, and they're going to be in on whoever the heck that is. You know what?
Absolutely. That's it. Exactly. Same way for Georgia too. Like anytime you see a high profile player, potential like All-American, All-Conference, immediately my mind goes to Alabama, because that's the players they're going to bring in. So that's when you start thinking about who could enter the portal, immediately draw a line to Tuscaloosa, because that's who they're probably going to be targeting.
Now we know, I don't want to skip ahead. How about Arkansas with, man, they've got some guys jumping in there, so they're going to need to replenish, and they did a heck of a job adding some nice pieces during the last transfer cycle. What positions of need do you see for the Razorbacks?
You know, I think the first thing is I trust Sam Pittman and this staff to do a good job in the portal. They've done it in the past. I think they'll do it again this year. I'm going to start with kind of an odd answer to you, and I think they need to get a quarterback, and not a starter, but with Malik Hornsby transferring, you've got to have somebody behind KJ Jefferson that you feel good about if he gets hurt. You need him as a runner, so I think you better have a good backup. Even if it's a guy who, you know, maybe started somewhere else, not going to be a starter, solidify that position. But I think the big position of need for Arkansas is defense, and it's really all across the board. If we assume Drew Sanders goes to the NFL, could be a need at linebacker. They've got to get tougher against the run. You look at the issues in the secondary. I mean, you can almost draw a list of needs, and they're all just on the defensive side of the ball. Arkansas will have some holes to fill along the line of scrimmage offensively. But if I'm Sam Pittman, I'm finding guys on defense who can come in and play right away. Not only starters, but just depth. You just need better depth across the board to compete and win in the SEC West.
So how about Auburn, Stephen? Now that we know Hugh Freeze is the coach, I would imagine, you know, players are going to be fired up. Some players are going to be not so fired up. And that's, you know, again, I'm not trying to take shots at Hughes. This is across the board whenever there's a coaching change. We see major roster turnover. So I could imagine you say any and all positions, but given what we know about Hugh Freeze and what he likes to do, what positions do you think Auburn really needs to add some pieces?
I think two positions come to mind right away. Number one is receivers. They need not only guys who can just be contributors, but they need some difference makers next season. Also, offensive line. They have several seniors who are going to be leaving. Everybody's going to be looking for offensive linemen in the portal, so that makes it hard. But they may just need to take some guys to fill out the two deep and to be able to compete for snaps in depth next year. So I think they've already, with Ashford, assuming he's back next year, you mentioned Hunter, they've got a nice backfield going. But I think to really take that offense up a notch and get going, they're going to have to find some linemen who can play right away, find some difference makers at receiver. Do think on the defensive side, I think restocking the front is pretty important. They were really, really struggled to stop the run this year. So line of scrimmage ought to be an area of need for Auburn this offseason.
Now, how about LSU, Stephen, where when Brian Kelly came in there, I think a lot of people were surprised how active the Tigers were in the transfer portal. A lot of that was roster attrition and of course, notably in the bowl game last year, they have like 38 scholarship players. So they really needed to add some bodies, but they connected on a lot. And we don't know Jaden Daniels, if he's going to come back yet or not. So that could certainly change your answer. But this is maybe a two-parter question here. Do you think LSU will be as active, or maybe they won't have that necessity? And what positions, of course, do you think they could use some help via the transfer portal?
I think they'll probably have to be active once again in the portal. I think the roster is getting closer, but it's just not there yet to be able to consistently compete against the Georgias and Alabamas. Like, you still need to continue to add depth and talent across the board. So I think give a lot of credit to Brian Kelly for coming in and looking at this roster and seeing that they needed help everywhere, and they got a lot of guys who contributed to the team this year. And at least if nothing else, they improved the depth, which is important considering some of the injuries that they had. I think offensive line, not to sound like a broken record, we've talked about it. It's going to be hard to get high-level guys to go all across the SEC. There's just not going to be 400 standout offensive linemen looking to transfer. So everybody's looking for offensive linemen. I suspect that will be an area of focus too for LSU, considering that group struggles this year. You look at their defensive depth chart, I think they probably could use some guys up front to restock there, but also in the secondary. It's where they brought in so many transfers last offseason. Depth was an issue. I think they'll probably need to add some guys there this year to just add talent, but also through some attrition as well. Overall, this roster, not in terrible shape. I think they're going to be picked, pretty high in early top 25s next year.
Now, how about the Portal King down there at Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin? We know he'll be active. What position groups do you think the Rebels attack?
I think Lane's going to be living in the transfer portal for the next month. In all seriousness, I think put every position on the table for Ole Miss. We saw it last offseason. Kiffin is not afraid to bring in pieces anywhere on the board. I think you could also start by looking at running back. Does Zach Evans come back to Ole Miss next year? Because if he doesn't, you're going to need somebody to team with Judkins. I think to help Jackson Dart get better, you need more difference makers at receiver. You're going to probably lose a couple guys there who are seniors. Defensively, we saw this team struggle down the stretch. I would be looking to help at every area of the depth chart. We saw Kiffin do this last year. I suspect he'll do it again this offseason. One wild card too, like Arkansas, I think backup quarterback with Altmaier entering the portal. You got to keep Jackson Dart healthy. You need him to be a part of the rushing attack. So you probably need to go get a backup or two that you feel okay about to be able to take a few snaps if he has to be out.
Now, how about Mississippi State, Stephen? They've been active as well in the transfer portal. They've added receivers. They've added a ton of defensive backs in the last cycle here in the transfer portal. So they're certainly not afraid to add via the transfer portal. What position groups do you think could really help the Bulldogs take that next step?
I think in the big picture, defense, because you look at Mississippi State's depth chart from this year, and some guys could come back and play the extra year, but there are a lot of seniors at every level of that defense. And it's just, it could be a significant loss to where they only have a couple starters back on that side of the ball. So I think in order to keep that side of the ball improving under Zach Garnett and to be able to replicate this season, getting to 8-4, they're going to have to reload on that side of the ball. I think offensively, you can never have enough difference makers at receiver under Mike Leach. So if you feel good about some receivers that can stretch the field a little bit more, definitely Leach will probably go after those guys. And like every team, looking for offensive line help because they're going to have some holes to fill up front. And that's still a group they probably need to continue to get better at.
Now, Texas A&M, they weren't very active in the last cycle. They added Max Johnson, and that may have been it via the transfer portal. I can't remember. But, of course, they added an elite recruiting class. Do you think A&M will be active in the portal?
I think they should be. I think, there's a lot of questions for me about direction. Who does Jimbo hire as offensive coordinator? Darell Dickey leaving. It's a big deal, but he wasn't the play caller. We'll see who fills that role for next season. And I think that also sort of speaks to like where the needs in the portal, it might be dictated by who the hire is. If you're going to really truly go more wide open and spread, you're probably going to need to find another running back to replace A-Chain. Offensive line, defensive line were two areas that this team struggled this year. Some of that was due to injuries. Some of that was due to youth. But still, I would look to add at those two positions to solidify for next year. Also think linebacker could be a spot where maybe they look to add some depth or some guys who could maybe push for starting jobs. I think a lot of what A&M's needs in the portal, like I said, will be dictated by the offensive coordinator hire. And also, I think how good do you feel about those 5-star, that freshman class, number 1 recruiting class? A lot of talent there. How good does Jimbo feel about them making the jump from year 1 to year 2?
Now, jumping over to the SEC East, even Florida was very active last season. Of course, they had the coaching turnover, so some of that was to be expected. This is a roster that I think could certainly use an infusion of talent pretty much across the board. I got to imagine receiver. That may be number 1 on your list here for the Gators.
It is. I think number 1 should be difference makers for whoever is the starting quarterback next year for Florida. You've got to find some more guys who can stretch the field, be more reliable playmakers. Ricky Pearsall was a great addition, but they need more of that in the portal. Also, we saw them bring in, Osiris Torrance from Louisiana. We keep talking about offensive linemen, but he was an impact addition. It helps that Napier coached him at Louisiana. Can you find some other guys in the portal to keep that offensive line trending in the right direction? Defensively, every position should probably be a spot where Florida looks for help. You can make a case secondary, defensive line. They need more difference makers at getting to the quarterback. So no position on the defensive side of the ball should be off the board. They should go heavy into defense and receiver if you're Florida in an attempt to get better in 2023.
Now, I don't believe Georgia added anybody. Of course, they add everybody they want in high school recruiting, basically, so the need is not necessarily there. Do you see any spots Georgia will look to add via the transfer portal, or will this be the same case as old Alabama, basically best available, maybe add a player or two?
That's exactly it. It's finding those Ferraris that enter the transfer portal. And if Alabama doesn't get them, you can bet that Georgia is going to make a run at them. I will tell you, I have started my early top 25 for next year, and there's a very high probability that Georgia will be picked number 1 when it comes out later this offseason. But I think if you wanted to look at some areas of maybe need for Georgia, I think receiver could be a spot where they could add somebody. I mean, McConkey's been great this year. Brock Bowers is back. A.D. Mitchell's been banged up this year too. So maybe you can go out and get someone else for whoever the starting quarterback is next year. Georgia's going to lose some guys in the front 7. I'm really not that worried about it just based upon the way they recruit, develop, and churn out great defenses. So Georgia will be very selective. Maybe receiver might be the biggest position of need, though.
Now, how about Kentucky? I have to imagine it's all about the quarterback because no disrespect to what was his name, Sharon or whatever, but I know they had a Deuce Hogan a couple was that last off season or two. But I mean, this is a big mystery with Will Levis off to the NFL. So quarterback, what other positions do you think Kentucky will attack via the transfer portal?
I agree with you on quarterback. I think if nothing else, if Kentucky feels good about the quarterbacks in the room, I would still add somebody for competition or just to give some experience. I mean, Cade McNamara from Michigan entered the transfer portal on Monday. Maybe not the most high upside guy, but he led Michigan to the college football playoff last year. And I think he could be a really solid option for a place like Kentucky, especially when you look at the playmakers that Kentucky has coming back. I mean, Brown and Key, that's going to be one of the better receiving duos in the SEC next year. So I start the list with quarterback, and I think it just goes back to offensive linemen. I mean, they allowed 42 sacks this year, the most in the SEC. It's going to be hard to find, a couple difference makers up front. But I think if you're Stoops, I think you have to try and go out and get a couple guys to either add competition or to start. I think you feel pretty good about your defense. I mean, Kentucky's going to have some losses at linebacker and in the secondary, but this is a place I think you just trust Stoops and that staff to figure it out. I think the checklist starts with figuring out who your OC is and what style, bring in a veteran quarterback, and then bring in some guys who can help improve the offensive line.
Any chance you think they bring in a running back with Chris Rodriguez off? And I know they liked some of the guys they got behind him, but they ain't Chris Rodriguez, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I agree with you. I think we've seen this in the SEC. Like, you need like 3 or 4 running backs sometimes to make it through a season. Ole Miss has been pretty fortunate that Evans and Judkins, the 1-2 punch that they had, made it through this year. So I could see that. I don't think you necessarily need a difference maker like to come in and start. Like, if you could find one, that's great. But I think you got some guys that Kentucky has felt good about. So maybe you can add another body or two to give you some depth there at Kentucky.
Now, how about Missouri, Stephen, where, man, arguably their best player, Dominic Lovett, off, or at least he reportedly going to be going into the portal. At least Luther Burden says he's sticking around, so with his chips and everything. So receiver could be a need. What do you think about Missouri, who they also added a ton of pieces on the defensive side last cycle in the transfer portal, and that really shored up a lot of their issues. What areas do you think the Tigers will attack?
I think the first thing is, like, give some credit to Eli Drinkowitz for what they did on defense last year, bringing in all those transfers. And I think that's an interesting case study because they did have some impact guys who started, but they also, I think, improved the depth across the board. And I think that that might be something that we see at Tennessee this offseason with defense. Maybe we see it at Florida. Maybe they're not all conference contributors, but if you can find some guys who can take some snaps away and are just rotation players, that's a pretty big win. We've seen how valuable depth is. So I really like what Missouri did last year. I think offense ought to be the focus this year, whether it's offensive line, whether it's receiver to replace Dominic Lovett. Maybe you bring in a veteran quarterback to push Brady Cook and Sam Horn as well. So I think there's a lot of needs on offense for Missouri, and that's where I would spend most of my offseason focus if I'm Eli Drinkowitz.
How about South Carolina, Stephen, where Shane Beamer and company, they were, they don't get the tag of Portal Kings, but they may get the tag of the East Portal Kings because they really knocked it out of the park with a lot of the additions they had last offseason.
They really did. I mean, Juice Wells has been a great pickup at receiver, not to mention Spencer Rattler. We've talked about him this episode, and I think that's kind of where it starts. I think whether or not he comes back sort of tells you where they might need to go in the portal. If he leaves, they may need to bring in a veteran quarterback who can maybe compete for the job or maybe start at least for the beginning of 2023. Some of those receivers that we talked about earlier, if they move on, if Wells moves on to the NFL, you're probably going to need to go out and get some guys. I also think just line of scrimmage has got to be an area of focus for South Carolina, whether it's offense or defense. that's one area that they have some catching up to do to some of the other teams in the league. Also, I would assume that Cam Smith is probably going to the NFL. He's been an awesome player for South Carolina the last couple of years. So getting more defensive backs should probably always be a priority for South Carolina this offseason.
Now, how about Tennessee, Stephen? And you better say defensive back, get some help down there on Rocky Top.
I wrote down defense. I could have just jotted it down like 100 times because you're right. I trust Heupel in this staff to figure things out offensively. There is going to be a new quarterback next year, whether it's Joe Milton, whether it's someone else. I think they'll be fine. They'll put up some points. They will need some receivers because I think we can safely assume that Jalen Hyatt will probably be very highly regarded among the NFL this offseason. And of course, you have to replace Cedric Tillman as well. But I think defense is really where the focus is for Tennessee. It's just all across the board. Secondary's got to be a priority. I think Missouri's game plan last year to just add a bunch of bodies is not a bad idea for Tennessee. You don't want to just take guys to take transfers, but you need help and you need depth across the board. And so I would spend most of my time on defense if I was Josh Heupel.
Now, last but not least, Vanderbilt. Do you see them as an active player in the transfer portal? I know they have previously, but certainly the rebuild is on and it is working. They're getting better each season under Clark Lee. They're doing a great job in high school recruiting. But I don't know. Do you think they add via the portal, or do they kind of stick to their recruit and develop strategy? What's your thoughts?
I think they'll be pretty selective because I think at a place like Vanderbilt, you do have to build through recruiting, and they're doing a great job of that. I think the question will be, can they supplement some of these pieces? We saw them bring in, was it Kane Patterson, and they also brought in another defensive back transfer last year. So I think they'll be active if there's a fit. I think if you had to make a list of needs for Vanderbilt, it's got to be, continuing to be line of scrimmage. They cut down on the sacks allowed from last year. You still got to get better up front. You got to get better up front on defense, pass defense. I could see all of those areas, whether it's OL, DL, secondary, all areas that they should look for improvement. If Ray Davis goes to the NFL, maybe you have to look at bringing in another running back or two to give you some depth. But I think optimistically, if you're Vanderbilt, you have a quarterback, whether it's Swan, whether it's Mike Wright, you have two options that you should feel good about building around, or at least a starting point for next year. And the question will be, can you supplement that side of the ball while also making your defense better, which is kind of surprising because that's Clark Lee's area of specialty. And I would expect that group, they do everything they need to get better on defense this offseason.
Now, here's something that just kind of occurred to me, Stephen, that I think more people, they are aware of it now, but maybe not to the degree that it's in college football. But we sit here and talk about, needs from roster to roster. But at the end of the day with NIL, I think that is going to be the primary reason a lot of these decisions are made. And we sit here and say Georgia and Alabama, they can pick whoever they want. That may be. But is a receiver going to pick Alabama over Auburn if Auburn's offering, I don't know, $10,000 more than Alabama? I think they're going to go with the highest bidder. So I don't know. What do you agree with that assessment?
I do. I think we will find out. I guess maybe the best way to word it is last year was sort of the starting point for the NIL and transfer mix. And I think as we go forward into this offseason, we will get a much better idea of how the collectives impact things, how this is all going to work, because I think you're right. Like, I think it is going to be a bidding war for some of the players. And I think you'll find, some differences. Like some are, for example, some players aren't necessarily into the NIL thing. They would prefer just to, go play and let that sort itself out in the NFL. some are really all about it. And so I think there will be some who are drawn to the NIL money, but some will just want to go and play at a place like Alabama or Tennessee where maybe they have a specific need. But this is really the first kind of better test of how this is all going to work. And I think I can safely say we're going to have some chaos over the next couple of weeks. That's probably the best prediction to make, is it's going to be chaotic, and it's certainly going to be interesting to see how the rosters are all constructed over the next couple of weeks.
And this is just my assumption, Stephen. I'm curious to get your thoughts, but do you think it'll be similar to an NFL model, to where quarterbacks will get the most, offensive tackles will get a ton, defensive backs, receivers, these are going to be high dollar amounts. And again, I'm not saying, if you were at SMU and you got 3 touchdowns, you're going to make a bunch of money. But if you're a guy that caught 10 touchdowns, like Dominic Lovett, it could be a bidding war between Alabama and Georgia and things of that nature. So do you think that could be the case where these position groups, and let's throw the entire offensive line into that mix, because there is so premium of those guys out there. Do you think it could be a case where it's similar to the NFL model, where certain position groups get the vast majority of the NIL funds thrown their way?
I agree with you. I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. It's a good offseason to be an offensive lineman, because there are not going to be many high profile, we just, based upon track record so far, you're not going to get 30 impact offensive linemen that can come to the SEC and start from day one and be an all conference performer. So I think you're right. You think quarterbacks, I think offensive linemen, I think difference makers on defense, like edge rushers, pass rushers, and cover corners. I think receivers, and they're certainly going to be valued, but I think that there will probably be a lot of receivers in there. And if you're a coach and you're worried about getting into a bidding war, are you going to go get the standout left tackle or the difference maker on defense? And I think that we'll see how that plays out. But my suspicion is like yours. It's going to be a lot like the NFL.
All right, and the final question I got for you, Stephen. Hey, have you seen any quarterbacks that have either already announced they're going into the portal or reportedly going into the portal that you think can play in the SEC? Just kind of like names to know.
I do. There are a couple here I would watch. The first one is Jeff Sims from Georgia Tech. He didn't start when they played Georgia on Saturday. A little bit of a, I think, inconsistent arm, but the skill set is there. He was a 4-star prospect coming out of high school. He was committed to Florida State. He went to Georgia Tech. I think he's someone with the right coaching can harness that talent and help him get back on track. So I would keep an eye on Jeff Sims. Cade McNamara from Michigan is the other one. I think just really efficient, solid quarterback, led Michigan to the college football playoff. Maybe not big plays in the passing game, but really just leading an offense, not making mistakes. I would have him right behind Jeff Sims as far as the top 2 quarterbacks in the portal. If you're looking beyond that, Hank Bachmeier, he was at Boise State. I don't know if he'll end up in the SEC, but I certainly think he's got, 3 years of starting experience and was probably not put in the best situation at the end of his career with a pretty poor offensive line. So it wouldn't surprise me if someone like him or even Brett Gabbert, Blaine's brother, who was at Missouri some time ago, those are probably your top 4 quarterbacks in the portal right now.
God, I would love if Harson's former quarterback made his way down to Auburn. How about that?
That would be something, wouldn't it? I mean, hey, you never know. I mean, a lot of things that we've seen in quarterback movement is, you have your starters that move from school to another school. And there's also a secondary market of guys who maybe they're not going to start, but they go somewhere because there's a need for a backup. So that would be quite the spicy story of a former Boise State quarterback coming to Auburn, and then his career takes off the year after Harsin is dismissed.
All right, Stephen, I really appreciate all your time. Some outstanding stuff from you as always. Before you go, can you tell the audience where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. So you mentioned transfers. I'm going to have a ton of transfer content at athlonsports.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at @AthlonSteven. And you can also check out my YouTube page, all CFB 365.
All right, another great one there. Getting longer and longer with Steven. He and I, sometimes we just sit here and talk. We talked about 20 minutes after I stopped recording. Should probably throw that up there too. It was so good. But just want to say thanks again, Steven, for joining the show, dropping some knowledge on the audience. Really appreciate each and every time he joins the show. But hey, another long one, so I'm going to cut it here. Cousin Shane be back on the next episode. Don't even know what we're going to be talking about. Now, I'm sure something will drop. We'll be talking all about Hugh Freeze, I'm sure, in this epic SEC championship game. But that is going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one.